Hello, welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. And in this video, I'm going to talk about Vendel Vikings. Vendel Vikings. Now that's a bit of a contradiction in terminology, isn't it? Well, yes, it is. It's quite a considerable contradiction in terminology, because if one was a Viking, well, one could not be a Vendel. Just as if one was a Vendel, one could not be a Viking. So how do we have these Vendel Vikings? Well, bear with me, and all shall be revealed in due course. This incidentally, is a Vendel era helmet, which we'll put down there. Now, as I said, Vendel Vikings is a contradiction in terminology. Not that Vendels or Vikings were actually different people. They weren't. They were exactly the same. Nor did they ever call themselves by those names. They were just Scandinavians, Norwegians, Danes, or Swedes, as the case might be. But as I said, Vendel Vikings are a contradiction in terminology, if not in physical actuality. Because the so-called Vendel era preceded the Viking Age. It's usually given as beginning roughly around 550 AD and ending in 793 AD, in which year the first official Viking raid occurred, when the monastic settlement on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as it is today, in the kingdom of Northumbria, was destroyed, and its treasures looted, sending panic through the Anglo-Saxons. And that began the Viking Age, which ended in 1066 with the death of the great Norwegian king Harald Sigurdsson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Now, the occasional raid still occurred after that, up to around 1100 AD, in fact, but they were insignificant, and they're not counted. There were probably minor raids going on between the various Scandinavian peoples themselves long before 793 AD, but they were local raids, often overland, maybe just into the next Jarldom, or somewhere a short boat journey away, somewhere along the coast, but confined to Scandinavia. But the raids that defined the Viking Age, now they required ships able to travel great distances across the open sea, not just hug the Baltic coastline and scurry into harbour if a storm seemed imminent. So, while the people referred to as Vendels or Vikings were one and the same, the Vendel era and the Viking Age are two quite separate, distinct periods of history. So how can there be Vendel Vikings if Vikings only existed after 793 AD? Now, the Lindisfarne raid, that wasn't actually the first Viking incursion into England. That, in fact, took place 4 years earlier, in 789 AD. Though, technically speaking, it wasn't really a raid. I mean, a raid is a get in, get what you want, grab it quick, and get out again. But the 789 incursion was more of a limited occupation, you might say, when 3 ships landed on the coast of Wessex, the Norsemen setting up camp there and demanding tolls from passing ships, and, well, voluntary contributions, shall we say, from the local English. Not really all that voluntary. Now, King Bjorn of Wessex sent his bailiff, a man named Bjorn, to find out who these people were and why they hadn't declared their intentions, but principally why they were collecting taxes, which of course should be his. The encounter between the bailiff and the Norsemen, it didn't really go too well. There was a little bit of a misunderstanding, you might say. And the king's bailiff and all his men were killed, the Norsemen withdrawing soon after. So you could reasonably, I suppose, date the Viking Age from 789 if you really wanted to. But as I say, it wasn't a raid as such. And as far as the accepted dates go, it did occur in the Vendel era, not the Viking Age. But it can be argued that Viking raids may have begun far sooner than is usually stated, and might even require the start date of the Viking Age to be put back anything up to 100 years, as we shall see in a moment. First, however, we must define the actual meaning of the term Viking, or Viking, as it was in Old Norse, since so many people are a bit confused about that. Vikingur was not a term of nationality. It was an activity. It was something you did. And it applied to anyone from any of the Scandinavian countries. So the common popular image of the Vikings as some sort of national group, all coming from the same place and doing the same thing, is quite incorrect. And in fact, the term Viking was only introduced into English centuries after the last longship had rotted away to dust. And no one called them Vikings 1,000 years ago. They didn't even call themselves Vikings. They were Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes. The Anglo-Saxons called them Dene or Danes, as well as heathens. To the Celtic Irish, they were Dovgal, the dark foreigners, the Danes, or Fingal, the fair foreigners, who were the Norwegians, as well as Gentiles. While to the Franks, they were the Normanni, or the Northmen, and later that became the Normans. While the Arabs, the Slavs, and the Byzantines called them Rus, from a word that meant to row a boat, from which of course came the names Russia and Belarus, where they settled. But the term Viking, now that has come to mean not just seaborne raiders, traders, or settlers from Scandinavia, but anyone from anywhere the Norse had settled, like Iceland or the Faroe Islands, or anything connected with them. Viking this or Viking that. Things such as Viking culture, Viking art, Viking religion, Viking ships, and whatever else you can think of got the Viking prefix added to them, even though none of them actually had anything to do with the word Vikinger, except for a ship. And even then, only in terms of those who sailed in it, not the ship itself. There was no such thing as a Viking ship. There were Norse ships in which Vikings sailed to pretty much everywhere in the known world, but there were no Viking ships as such. There was no Viking music or Viking art, though there was plenty of Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish music and art. Vikinger meant one basically who got in a ship, and they went somewhere in that ship, and they did something or other when they got to wherever it was they got in the ship, be it raiding, trading, exploration, founding settlements, or just a boat trip to pass the time on a slow day. It can be said to mean a seafarer or a pirate or an adventurer, but it has nothing to do with the nationality of those doing it. In other words, you could go Viking, but you couldn't be Viking. And once you got out of the ship and you went home, well, you were no longer Vikings. You were just Danes, Norwegians, or Swedes once again. Just as the settlements they established in other lands, such as here in Ireland, for example, they were not Viking settlements. Once they settled down, built towns, grew crops, raised farm animals, and had children, they were just Scandinavian settlers. Their Vikingness had been left in the ships. So basically, as long as they were not leaping off the ship to do it, well, they were not Vikings. So, to the question of when long-distance raiding requiring ships able to venture out across the open sea actually began. Now, this, of course, is what everybody would think of when you say a Viking ship. The shields along the side, the fearsome dragon or sea serpent head on the prow, and so on. But this was the end result of decades, centuries even, of development. You know, these things didn't just suddenly pop up out of nowhere in 793. Suddenly pop, there's these sailing around all over the place. Bronze Age rock carvings do show that shipbuilding had been practiced in Scandinavia for centuries before the eventual emergence of the legendary longship. Methods of construction have been improved and honed to perfection. Navigational skills have been refined. Centuries of expertise had been built up. The first proper boat that we know of is the Hotsping boat, dating from the Iron Age, circa 400 BC. Very similar in appearance to the Bronze Age rock carvings, some 62 feet long, and it seems to have been propelled using paddles. The first of what really could be considered as some sort of a proto-longship is the Nidum boat. The first that we know of that was rowed rather than paddled, and slightly raised at both ends, made in Denmark circa 350 AD, but not strong enough to have carried a mast, and sails don't seem ever to have been used until the 8th century, when ships were built with strong enough frames to support it. Around 700 AD, the first proper keel was devised, found in the Kvalsund ship, a vessel large enough to carry passengers and crew out to sea. And this is the keel on the ship. Basically, a ship-length wooden beam that holds the whole vessel together and gives it added strength, allowing it to be fitted with a mast or a sail. The techniques found in these early vessels were refined and carried over into what we call the Viking Age, which culminated by the end of the 8th century in the awesome longships as we know them. Yes, our little friend here again. And perhaps the finest vessels ever made for their intended purpose. Ships that seemed almost to glide over the surface of the water rather than in it. Ships that would carry the Norse people across most of the known world, from the Middle East to North America and everywhere in between. These amazing new ships expanding the ability to reach other lands that lay far out to the west across the open sea. And raiding began on a scale hitherto impossible, as of course did trade and settlement. And that's something that should not be forgotten. These ships were responsible for a vast amount of exploration, trade, settlement. Most of the towns in Ireland, in fact, were founded by people who had come in one of these. Now, at least, that is what we supposed. But that may not be quite correct. In fact, the actual start of the Viking Age may have been as much as a century earlier than we previously thought, and a vessel similar to the Kvalsund ship may have actually begun it. Now, this information, it isn't new. The initial archaeological surveys were completed in 2012, so this has been known for quite a while. But very little notice ever seems to have been taken of it for some reason, which totally escapes me. There have been no suggestions that I've seen regarding changing the dating of the Viking Age, nor really any great mention of the archaeological finds themselves, other than by the archaeologists who worked on it at the time. There was a BBC programme broadcast in 2014 about a superb Viking exhibit in the British Museum, and in that a commentator mentioned 750 AD as being the start of the so-called Viking Age. And I sort of went, oh, didn't see that coming. So perhaps notice was taken of the discovery, at least by the British Museum at that time, if not by anybody else, since that is the only mention I've seen of that date in the context of the beginning of the Viking Age. If anyone knows different, well, I'd like to hear about it. In 2008, workmen laying electrical cables on the Estonian island of Salme in the Baltic Sea came across bones and various small objects, which they assumed probably belonged to soldiers from World War II, since though there was a great deal of fighting there. They took no notice of them and they cleared them out of the way. But when an archaeologist came to identify the remains, she spotted that though they were clearly not as recent as the Second World War, old carved gaming pieces made from whalebone, as well as a spearhead, were very clear evidence of that. I mean, they weren't chucking spears at one another in World War II. And the finds indicated a Scandinavian origin from Sweden. Further investigation discovered the remains of a ship 38 feet long, although almost all of the timbers had long since rotted away, leaving little more than an impression in the ground. But there were hundreds of iron rivets that had held the craft together, and they had fallen in place. And between the two, they were able to trace the outline of the ship. Now, this was clearly not just some little fishing or local trading craft. It was narrow, it was lightly made of clinker construction, and that is where wooden planks are overlaid working upwards. Each row of planks fastened to the top of the planks below and riveted together. And it would have been very fast. Now, this was seen as clearly a warship, and obviously well able to navigate far out to sea from the safety of the coastline, since it's over 150 miles to Salme Island from mainland Sweden, where it was thought that the ship had originated. And even if it had travelled from Gotland rather than the mainland, well, that would still entail a voyage of something over 100 miles across open sea. And the Baltic is prone to storms and very heavy seas. Carbon dating established that it had been constructed in the first decades of the 8th century, from 700 to 750 AD, at least 40 and as much as 100 years before the first credited Viking raid took place. It would have been driven by oars. There was no indication of a sail, and remarkably, its crew was still on board. 7 men, their ages ranging from 18 to approximately 45. Examination of the teeth, plus the style of artifacts discovered, seem to indicate that the men had come from central Sweden.
We are Geats. I am Beowulf, son of Ecgthal.
Most interestingly, though, there were bodies that were not a burial ship as such. I mean, these bodies can't be seen as having been buried. It was not a burial ship like the famous Osberg ship, which had been the tomb of an obviously very important woman. No, the men found on board this vessel had not been ceremonially buried with the ship, laid out with their weapons and other items carefully arranged around them. Instead, some lay against what would have been the side of the hull in a sitting position. Others lay together or in pairs haphazardly around the ship. This was more like the men had actually died on the ship, perhaps killed there, and they'd been left pretty much where they fell. Knives, a comb made from bone, whetstones for sharpening weapons, and the like were recovered. But things were to get a great deal more interesting just 2 years later, when a second and very much larger ship was discovered only 100 feet away. Clearly a related vessel. There had been 2 ships sailing together. And both crews had died, somehow or other, and had been left with their ships. The small ship was dubbed Salme I, the larger one Salme II. Now, Salme I was a remarkable find in itself, a ship discovered with its crew still on board. But Salme II was even more exciting, a considerably larger vessel. Tracing the outline left by the iron rivets showed it to have been 55 feet long by 10 feet wide. Like the Carlson ship, it had a proper keel, and a large amount of iron, wood debris, and the remnants of cloth found at the center of the ship indicated it had a mast and a sail, and that would make it the oldest Scandinavian ship ever found that was propelled by a sail as well as oars. Like Salme I, the crew were still on board. 33 men, and big, powerful men too. Some of them would have been over 6 feet tall, which would have made them very formidable warriors in that age. They would have been almost giants. People would have been literally looking up to them. And a number of the men, when their heights were checked, it gave an average height of around 5 foot 10 inches, which was also large enough for those times. A number of them had obvious injuries to their bones that had long since healed, indicating they had been in the previous combat. These were certainly warriors. And there were injuries that had probably killed some of them as well. One man had the entire top of his skull sliced off by what appeared to be a sword, while another had his arm severed. And there were arrowheads found among the bodies, which had probably been embedded in them and fell out as the bodies decayed. And unlike Salme I, these men had been laid out ceremonially at one end of the ship, in what was clearly an organized manner, not just dumped willy-nilly. And their weapons and belongings were placed around them, their bodies covered with their shields. They would, of course, have long since rotted away, but the bronze shield bosses were still in place, as well as some of the grips. And bits of material found among them could have been part of a sail that had been perhaps draped over them. Numerous artifacts were recovered, including a large number of swords, spears, and arrowheads, a bear claw necklace, knives, gaming pieces made from deer antlers or whalebone, as well as 2 ritually sacrificed dogs and hawks, the latter probably having been used for falconry. There were also indications that suggested the placement of the bodies was related to their social status, with the lower class on the bottom and the upper class on the top, as it would have been in life. Those at the bottom seem to be of a lower social standing than some at the top, having very ordinary single-edged swords without any ornamentation. They would have been very much the cheapy department store swords of the day, while the 5 men whose bodies were above them had double-edged swords with expensive and elaborately decorated bronze grips, guards, and pommels, suggesting that they were nobles, or certainly men of some considerable importance. Given that the men on Salme I were seemingly ordinary in status and had just been left scattered about, they weren't important enough to bother picking them up, while those on Salme II had been carefully arranged and clearly indicated prominent and important men, it has been suggested that the ship carried perhaps a jarl and his bodyguards, or at least some very, very important man, that it was the flagship, if you like, while the other carried less important persons, servants and retainers, and may even have been a transport or supply vessel accompanying the larger and more important ship. But that still left the question what had caused 2 ships to be beached and their dead crews left on board, and who had arranged the bodies on Salme II, surviving crew members or a victorious enemy, showing care and respect to the crew of one ship while leaving the crew of the other pretty much where they fell. If it had been survivors, well, that would seem to indicate at least a 3rd ship, since otherwise they would have taken one of the ships themselves, unless, of course, both the ships had been damaged and were unseaworthy. Arrowheads were found in such a way that seemed to indicate they had been embedded in the outside of the larger ship's hull, and they fell out as the timbers rotted away. And some of the arrows had been of the fire-bearing type, which would have been used to set an enemy ship on fire or to set thatched roofs on fire. They have a sort of basket at the end, and the flammable material is put into that basket. You don't just wrap it around a normal arrowhead. And that, of course, raises the possibility of a battle at sea that either was carried onto the land or the ships were beached afterwards, perhaps damaged during the battle. The most probable scenario seems to be that there was a battle between the Swedes and someone else, obviously. One would have to assume the Estonians, and the Swedes lost rather badly. And possibly surviving Swedes yielded and were allowed to ceremonially place their important dead in the larger ship before maybe leaving in a 3rd ship, unless, of course, the survivors were also killed and they were added to the pile. Well, that does seem a bit unlikely. I think the Estonians would hardly finish the burial ritual for them. And I think we have to assume it was other Swedes who were responsible for the boat burial. Though it wasn't really a burial as such. I suppose we shouldn't refer to it as a boat burial. No mound was built over the ships, as was normally done in boat burials, such as the one at Osberg. The vessel seemed to have been simply dragged ashore up to a point beyond the high tide level and left there. The men covered with their shields and the sail and then left. Now, on the face of it, there would seem pretty conclusive evidence that this was a raiding party, and things went very much not to plan. But there's an alternate theory about what these ships were doing, given aspects of what was on board, since it has been said that the dogs and the hawks seem to indicate a more peaceful intent on the part of whoever had been using the 2 ships. Raiders, it was suggested, would hardly be intending to stop for a bit of falconry, so why did they have hawks, or dogs for that matter? And the suggestion was that they had been on a peaceful voyage, perhaps a diplomatic mission of some kind, or just trading. To be honest, the fact that somebody had shot the ships full of arrows, to say nothing of slicing off bits of the crew's bodies, would seem to me to make that rather unlikely, unless, of course, it had turned out to be a very unsuccessful bit of diplomacy, or somebody really didn't like whatever it was they were trading. I think the peaceful voyage idea totally fails to answer several important questions. Why were the ships fired on? Why were so many of the crew killed? Why were the ships abandoned with all those bodies on board if they had not been on a warlike mission? Of course, the arrows could have dated from some previous hostile encounter, and perhaps the crews had simply snapped off the shaft, intending to dig out the arrowheads at a later date. But that still does not explain the dead crew hit by arrows themselves and bits of them sliced off. Unless, of course, they overdid the partying with the local Estonians. Some of them got killed in a drunken brawl, the rest drank themselves to death, and the Estonians were really kind enough to put them into their ships. Yeah, which does seem a little hard to believe. As to the hawks and dogs, I see no reason really to see them as indicating a peaceful voyage. After all, that the crew might stop along the way for a bit of falconry is entirely credible. I'm sure they would go ashore periodically. Well, they would to get water, to supplies, etc. But there's another interesting thing about that. They are mentioned by the archaeologists as having been ritually sacrificed. But why and by whom? Presumably by whoever arranged the bodies, perhaps sending them to accompany their masters in the afterlife. Dogs, we know, were killed in that manner, as were horses. But it shows that there must have been some ceremony involved by those who had laid out the bodies. They didn't just pile them up, put their shields on them, chuck a sail over them, and go. They performed some kind of funeral rites. And that does strongly suggest that it was fellow Swedes who were responsible. Even if they were paying some respect to fallen warriors, it seems highly unlikely that the Estonians would have gone as far as that, though I suppose it is possible. But what if, given the circumstantial evidence put forward by some for a kind of peaceful voyage, and that it wasn't a raiding party, there was no intent to go and burn something or whatever, it was just a peaceful voyage that ended up very unpeacefully, would that alter its status as a Viking expedition and any change in the date of the Viking Age be required as a result? Well, no. No, it wouldn't. As I said earlier, to be Vikinger, one had to go somewhere in a ship. And clearly the men on board those two ships had done exactly that. They had got on them and they had gone somewhere. There was no specific requirement to raid, to pillage and burn things, to found a settlement or do anything else whenever they got wherever they were going. The going off in a ship in itself was enough. That made them Vikinger. So a trading or diplomatic mission would still make them Vikinger. Even if all they did when they got to Estonia was drink mead, exchange gifts, and look for a woman for the night, it would make no difference. They had got in a ship, they had gone somewhere, they were Vikinger. So whatever the purpose of the men in those two ships was, and that is something, of course, we shall never know with absolute certainty, they had crossed the sea, they had gone somewhere in a ship, and thus they were Vikings. They weren't just Swedes out for a boat trip. So, should the Viking Age be dated as beginning considerably earlier, to 750 AD, as the British Museum seems to suggest, back to 700 AD even? Or should the Vendel era be credited with the first Viking raids outside of Scandinavia? Could go either way, I suppose. Although we can't say for certain that those ships were actually raiding, however likely that would seem to be, or that they were trading, or whatever in fact they were doing, but they were Vikings in the accepted definition of that word. Of course, given the Old Norse predilection for, shall we say, forcibly borrowing things from people who had stuff that they desired, one might well have raided one place while on a peaceful mission to somewhere else. That is entirely possible. And they had been killed on the way back, having completed their diplomatic mission or trading or whatever else they were actually doing, saw what seemed to be an easy target as they passed by, and attempted an unsuccessful raid on the return voyage. That would, I suppose, reconcile the battle damage and the deaths with the hawks and the dogs. I think all in all this has to be seen as a raid, or at least some type of military action that went seriously wrong, regardless of anything else they may have engaged on during the voyage. Nothing else really fits the archaeological evidence. It must be borne in mind that the men on board, many of them had suffered combat injuries. They had been in battle. So these were not just traders. These weren't a bunch of merchants going off to trade something. These were warriors, which does not say they could not have been engaged in peaceful activities. They could have been trading that as well. But they were warriors. They were not just merchants, and that is quite important, I think. Nothing really other than some form of combat obviously fits the archaeological evidence, or so it seems to me. So there we leave this fascinating discovery, be it the result of a raid that failed, a peaceful, sight-exchanging excursion across the Baltic, a trade deal that was unsuccessful in the extreme, or anything else you care to see it as. Your guess is as good as anyone else's, since we really have no idea what actually occurred. So, with that, I shall say farewell, goodbye, until next time. Goodbye for now.